The encounter. Officer Ethan Carter had always considered Joe's Diner to be a quiet sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos of his day-to-day life as a cop, even if only for a brief moment. The late-night crowd was typically sparse, the kind of people who were either trying to unwind or simply passing through after long shifts, just like him. The warm, yellow lights overhead seemed to cast a comforting glow on the cracked vinyl booths and chipped counter, creating a sense of nostalgia that was hard to ignore. It was a place where you could sit back and take a breath before heading back out into the storm of life. Tonight, however, something felt different. The familiar hum of conversation and clatter of silverware suddenly seemed like a distant murmur in Ethan's mind, as though he had stepped into a world slightly out of sync with the one he knew. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint jingle of the bell above the door, signaling a new arrival. At first, Ethan didn't think much of it, but when he glanced up, his eyes immediately fixed on the small figure standing just inside the doorway. It was a boy, no older than 8 or 9, from the looks of him. His face was a mix of uncertainty and fear, and his body was thin, his clothes too big and rumpled, as if they had been hastily thrown on. His sneakers were scuffed and worn, his jeans tattered at the hems. The boy's eyes darted nervously around the diner, scanning the room as though looking for someone. It was as though he didn't quite belong, yet at the same time, he was desperately searching for something, some kind of safety or comfort. For a moment, Ethan did nothing but watch the boy. The child seemed almost out of place in the bright, welcoming atmosphere of Joe's Diner. There was something in the way he moved that made Ethan uneasy, a subtle tension in his small frame that suggested he was in more than just casual distress. It wasn't the kind of behavior that most kids his age would exhibit. This wasn't the shyness of a child who was just a little out of their element. It was the palpable fear of someone who had seen or experienced something that had shaken them to their core. Ethan shifted in his seat, his police instincts kicking in. He was used to being alert, scanning people for any signs of trouble. But this felt different. This wasn't just a kid who had wandered in to escape the cold. There was something beneath the surface that made his gut twist with unease. As Ethan's eyes tracked the boy's movements, he noticed that the child seemed to lock onto him. There was a flicker of recognition, relief, maybe, in the boy's eyes, and for just a second, it almost seemed like the world around them slowed down. The boy took a few tentative steps forward, and it was clear he was heading toward Ethan's table. The diner around them seemed to fade away, the chatter of the other patrons growing muffled. The only sound Ethan could focus on was the soft shuffle of the boy's feet as he drew closer. Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. It wasn't just a matter of concern anymore. This felt like an unspoken call for help. "Hey, kid," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm, wanting to reassure the boy that he was safe now. "Are you okay?" The boy stopped just a few feet away from the table, his small body tense as though preparing for something, perhaps a confrontation, or maybe even an escape. His eyes were wide with fear, yet there was something else beneath that fear, something that made Ethan's pulse quicken. It wasn't just that the boy was scared. It was that his fear seemed to be rooted in something much larger than himself, something that Ethan couldn't yet comprehend. The boy's eyes flicked around the room again, searching the diner, his head jerking back to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. Then, without warning, his gaze returned to Ethan, and he took a small, hesitant step forward. His breath was shallow, almost shaky, and his hands clenched into tiny fists at his sides, as though he was struggling to hold back an overwhelming emotion. "I need help," the boy whispered, barely audible, his voice so small it was almost drowned out by the quiet hum of the diner. His words seemed to hang in the air, laden with a weight that Ethan couldn't quite place. Ethan's mind raced, and his instincts flared. His first thought was that the boy was just another lost child, a runaway, or perhaps one who had become separated from his parents. But the desperation in his voice made Ethan reconsider. There was more to this. The child was afraid, but it wasn't just fear of being lost. It was fear of something or someone that was much more immediate. "Where are your parents?" Ethan asked softly, trying to coax the boy into trusting him. His tone was calming, like he would speak to anyone in distress, but there was an edge of concern that couldn't be hidden. The boy's lip trembled as he glanced toward the door once more, his small form seeming to shrink into itself as though trying to disappear into the floor. He shook his head slowly, his eyes welling up with tears. "I can't," he muttered, his voice strained. "I can't go back." Ethan's heart sank. There was something in the boy's eyes, something dark, something old. It was as though he had seen things a child should never have to witness. Ethan could feel a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just about a missing child. This was something far more complicated. "Hey," Ethan said gently, leaning in, trying to make himself less intimidating. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here. You can tell me what's going on." The boy blinked rapidly, his eyes darting between Ethan and the exit, as if he was trying to decide whether he could trust the officer. Then, after what felt like an eternity of silence, the boy spoke again. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Ethan caught every word. "Don't trust him," the boy said, his gaze narrowing in fear. "Don't trust anyone. They're coming." The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Ethan's body tensed as he instinctively reached for his radio, his fingers brushing over the device as the boy's words rang in his ears. The child's warning didn't make sense. Who was he talking about? Who was coming? The boy's eyes were wide with terror now, and as quickly as he had approached Ethan, he took a step back, his legs shaking as if he were about to bolt. Ethan's heart raced. Something was terribly wrong, and the boy knew something that Ethan needed to understand. Before Ethan could say anything else, the boy turned and sprinted toward the door. It all happened so quickly. 1 second the boy was standing there. The next he was gone, disappearing into the cold night air without a sound. Ethan stood up, his mind spinning, his body reacting faster than his thoughts could process. "Wait," he called after the boy, but the door slammed shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. For a moment, everything was still. The sounds of the diner, of clinking forks and low murmurs, felt oddly distant, as if they were no longer part of his reality. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as his mind tried to catch up with what had just happened. What the hell was that? The boy's warning echoed in his mind, and Ethan could feel a growing sense of urgency in the pit of his stomach. Something was off. Something was wrong. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it had just started. Ethan reached for his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed the number for dispatch. His heart was racing, but he knew he had no time to waste. "Officer Carter, I need backup," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Something happened. I don't know what, but I need you to check the area. I'm going after that kid." As he ended the call, Ethan stepped out of the diner, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The boy was gone, but the feeling, the sense of impending danger, remained. Something was coming, something he couldn't see, but he knew it was close, and he had no idea how deep this mystery ran. The chase begins. Officer Ethan Carter's eyes scanned the empty street in front of Joe's diner, the neon lights flickering above, casting long shadows along the pavement. The cool night air bit at his skin as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the dark, forming clouds that quickly dissipated into the frigid air. His mind raced, still processing the strange encounter with the boy. The eerie urgency in the child's voice replayed in his mind. "Don't trust anyone. They're coming." Ethan's grip tightened around his radio, his senses heightened to the point where every sound, every movement in the night felt amplified. The silence of the street was deafening, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath in the wake of the boy's sudden disappearance. A part of him wanted to believe it had all been some kind of trick, a child's overactive imagination, or maybe even a prank. But something deep inside told him it was far from that. He glanced around once more, his eyes flicking to the dark alleyways that led off the street. The boy had disappeared into the shadows, too quickly for Ethan to catch up to him. A pang of frustration gripped him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't the time to be angry. It was the time to act. Taking a deep breath, Ethan unclipped his radio from his belt, his voice low but firm as he spoke into it. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I'm heading after the child now. He just fled the diner. We need a search team in the area, immediately." There was a slight pause before the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Copy that, Officer Carter. Backup is en route. Please stay in contact." Ethan didn't wait for another word. His boots hit the pavement with a steady rhythm as he jogged down the street, his mind calculating the possible escape routes the boy might have taken. His instincts as a cop screamed at him to stay calm, but there was something in the air tonight, something that gnawed at him, making it impossible to ignore the growing feeling of dread crawling up his spine. As he turned the corner of the diner, he spotted the faintest signs of movement. A small figure darting between two buildings in the distance. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as his feet instinctively quickened. The boy was fast, faster than Ethan had anticipated. But even as he pushed his legs to run faster, his thoughts raced even quicker. Who was this child? Why had he approached Ethan? And what did he mean by "don't trust anyone"? They're coming. Was the boy in danger? Was there something bigger going on here that Ethan had no idea about? The alley was narrow, its walls pressing in on him as he sprinted, keeping his eyes on the figure in the distance. The boy had been fast, but Ethan's training gave him an edge. He was determined to close the distance between them, but with every step, his mind began to fill with more questions. Why would a child be so terrified? What could possibly make him so afraid that he felt the need to warn a complete stranger, a cop, no less, about something dangerous? The night air was filled with the sound of Ethan's breathing, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls as he chased after the boy. His eyes darted left and right, scanning every crevice, every shadow, every possible hiding spot. But the alley stretched on with no sign of the child. Ethan's frustration mounted, the silence in the alley oppressive, and his mind spun faster. Then, a movement. A flash of the boy's dirty sneakers disappearing into the dim light of an alleyway to his left. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he pivoted sharply, his focus narrowing to the narrow gap between the two buildings. He pushed himself harder, reaching the entrance of the alley just in time to see the boy slip into the shadows. But when Ethan entered the alley, the child was gone. The boy had vanished once again, as if he had melted into the darkness. Ethan cursed under his breath, frustration now clouding his judgment. Where had he gone? It didn't make sense. There were no other exits from this alley, nothing but solid walls on both sides. It was impossible for the child to have disappeared like that unless... A sudden noise, a faint scuffling sound, echoed off the alley's brick walls. Ethan froze, his body tensing as his eyes darted toward the source of the noise. His heart pounded in his chest as he held his breath, trying to focus on the sound, trying to make sense of it. There, a faint shadow moved near the end of the alley. Without thinking, Ethan took off toward it, his pulse quickening as he closed the distance between him and the mysterious figure. He had to catch the boy. He had to understand what was going on. But as he reached the end of the alley, the shadow was gone. Ethan skidded to a stop, his breath coming in heavy gasps as he scanned the area. There was nothing but a dead end, a brick wall, and a stack of forgotten crates. The boy had vanished again. Ethan clenched his fists in frustration. How was this possible? Just as he was about to turn around and head back toward the diner, a voice broke through the silence. It was soft, almost too soft to hear, but it was unmistakably familiar. Don't trust him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he felt the blood drain from his face. The voice wasn't the boy's. It wasn't the voice of anyone he recognized, but the words sent a chill down his spine. Don't trust him. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no one there. The alleyway was completely empty. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, nothing. Panic surged through him as he reached for his radio again, his fingers trembling slightly as he spoke. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I need backup now. Something's not right. There's someone else in the area. I can feel it." His radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice, but the words were distorted, difficult to make out. Ethan cursed under his breath, turning in a slow circle as his eyes scanned the alley for any sign of life. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he had the distinct feeling that he was being watched. But by whom? The words still rang in his ears. Don't trust him. A cold, eerie realization washed over him. The boy wasn't just running from something. He was running from someone. Someone powerful enough to make a small child terrified. Someone who was now apparently aware of Ethan's presence in the area. Whoever it was, they were watching him, and he had no idea who they were or what they wanted. The air felt suddenly heavier, the darkness deeper, as if the world around him had shifted. This was no longer just a missing child case. This was something much bigger and much more dangerous. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped back toward the main road. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. Something told him that this wasn't just going to be a simple investigation. He was about to be pulled into a much darker, more twisted story, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what he might uncover. But he had no choice. He had to find the boy. He had to find out who, or what, was coming. The hidden truth. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear as he walked away from the dead-end alley. The streets were still eerily quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic, the only sound breaking through the thick silence. His thoughts were heavy, his heart racing as his instincts told him something deeper was at play. The boy's cryptic warning, "Don't trust him," repeated in his mind, but there was a new feeling gnawing at him. A cold unease that he couldn't shake, as if the air itself was thick with danger. With his radio still crackling faintly at his side, Ethan continued to pace the street, unable to ignore the growing sense of urgency. It wasn't just about finding the boy anymore. It was about understanding why he was so terrified, and what he meant by "they're coming." Ethan's first instinct had been to look for the boy, this small child who was obviously running from something terrifying. But now he understood he was hunting something much more sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control of this situation. The events had escalated quickly, spiraling beyond the scope of a simple missing child case. Whoever or whatever was behind this was watching him now. The weight of that thought settled like a stone in his stomach. His footsteps echoed down the street as he neared the corner. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his reverie. He pulled it out, and the name on the screen stopped him in his tracks. Officer Daniels. His heart skipped a beat. Daniels had been his partner for years, the one person he trusted more than anyone else. There was no reason for him to be calling, unless... "Ethan, where are you?" Daniels' voice crackled through the speaker, urgency lacing his words. "I've been getting reports. Something strange is going on. The area's been flagged." Ethan's pulse quickened. "I'm out on a chase. I saw the boy. He's gone. But..." "I know," Daniels cut him off, his voice sharp with tension. "There's something you need to know. Something big. We've got intel. It's not just a kid running from an abusive home, or whatever you thought at first. Ethan, this is way bigger." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Daniels hesitated for a moment before continuing, as if weighing the gravity of the information he was about to share. "It's not just a missing kid. There's been a pattern of strange disappearances in this area. A series of children have gone missing over the past few months, all with no trace. And the thing is, no one's talking about it. No media, no investigation. It's all been covered up, like someone's making it go away." Ethan's blood ran cold. The pieces were slowly starting to come together in a way he wasn't ready for. Covered up? By who? "That's what I don't know," But there's something else, Daniel said, his voice dropping lower, as though he were afraid of being overheard. I did a little digging. Those children, they weren't just ordinary kids. They were taken for a reason. Their DNA, Ethan, it's not normal. There's something about them, something they share in common. Ethan's stomach turned. What are you talking about, Daniels? I don't know yet, but I think they're experimenting on these kids, Ethan. And I think that boy, whoever he is part of it. I need you to be careful. Someone's trying to erase all this, and you've already got their attention. Ethan felt his world tilt on its axis, experimenting on children. It was too much to process, but he couldn't deny it. The boy's behavior, the fear in his eyes, the cryptic words, all of it pointed to something much more insidious than he could have ever imagined. Daniel's eye. I don't know what to do. The kid just ran off. But he said something, he warned me. He said, don't trust anyone. And now, I'm thinking he was trying to tell me something important. Trust your gut, Ethan. You've been doing this long enough to know when something's off. Follow the trail. I'm getting a team together. We'll track down those kids, but for now, get back to the diner. I'll have backup there in 15 minutes. Just don't do anything reckless. Got it, Ethan replied, his voice tight with resolve. I'm going back. Thanks, Daniels. As he ended the call, Ethan's heart raced with more questions than answers. The strange series of disappearances, the boy's cryptic message, and now the possibility of sinister experiments on children. He couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't just a simple case anymore. It was an open door into something terrifying, and if he didn't act fast, it could swallow him whole. He turned on his heel, his footsteps heavy as he walked back toward the diner. The lights of the small building ahead cast a warm glow against the cool night, but to Ethan, the diner now seemed less like a place of comfort and more like the epicenter of something dark and dangerous. When he reached the diner, the bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The same quiet chatter filled the air, but his senses were heightened. Everything felt off. The boy had been there, and now there was something waiting for him, something that couldn't be ignored. Behind the counter, the waitress, a middle-aged woman with dark curls and tired eyes, gave Ethan a brief nod of recognition. She seemed too busy to offer more than a polite acknowledgement, but Ethan wasn't interested in small talk. He made his way to the same booth where he had been sitting earlier, his eyes moving rapidly as he took in the space. It was then that he saw it. In the far corner of the diner, a man sat alone. His features were nondescript, blonde hair, average build, wearing a simple jacket and dark jeans. But there was something in the way he sat, something about the way he was watching Ethan that sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't just a man enjoying a meal at the diner. He was too still, too focused. Ethan's instincts flared. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling in his gut told him this man was involved. He had to be. With slow, deliberate movements, Ethan made his way to the counter, his eyes never leaving the man. As he passed by, he overheard a faint murmur of conversation between the man and the waitress. The words were muffled, but one thing stood out. "We're ready to move." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Who were they moving? And why had the man's eyes locked onto him the moment he entered? The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end. He knew that he was no longer chasing a runaway boy. He wasn't even chasing a missing child anymore. He was chasing something much bigger, something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The man at the corner booth hadn't just been watching him. He had been waiting for him. Ethan's mind was in overdrive, and his pulse quickened as he took a seat at the counter. Trying to act nonchalant as he slid his phone from his pocket, he sent a quick text to Daniels. "Something's off. I'm in position. Need backup now." Just as he hit send, the man stood up, his movements swift and calculated. He grabbed his coat, adjusting it with an eerie calmness, and made his way toward the door. But as he reached the exit, he turned briefly to look at Ethan, his eyes cold and unreadable. And in that fleeting moment, something passed between them. Ethan's breath hitched, the realization dawning on him. The boy had been right. They were coming. The web tightens. Ethan's pulse raced as the man in the corner booth walked toward the diner's exit. Every instinct in him screamed that this was no coincidence, no casual diner encounter. The way the man moved, the calmness in his demeanor, it all felt orchestrated. He wasn't just some passerby. He was someone with a purpose. And now, it seemed, that purpose involved Ethan. The bell above the diner's door jingled as the man stepped outside, disappearing into the darkness of the street. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping noisily against the tile floor. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about finding the boy anymore. It was about uncovering a dangerous conspiracy, one that was beginning to entangle him in ways he couldn't yet understand. He took a few quick steps toward the door, his mind already calculating the next move. Was the man connected to the missing children? Was he somehow involved in whatever was happening? Ethan didn't know, but he had a feeling that tracking this man down could lead him to the answers he needed. As he reached the door, he pushed it open just in time to see the man round the corner, his figure a silhouette against the dim streetlights. Ethan's heart quickened, and without a second thought, he followed. The cool night air hit him like a wall as he stepped onto the pavement, his eyes immediately locking onto the figure in the distance. The man wasn't running. He was walking briskly, almost too calmly, as if he knew Ethan was tailing him. That only made Ethan more certain that he was on the right track. Whoever this man was, he had information that Ethan needed, and he wasn't going to let him slip away. Ethan quickened his pace, staying as far back as possible to avoid being noticed. He didn't want to alert the man that he was being followed, but his mind raced with questions. What was going on? Who were these people that had been taking children? Why hadn't anyone else, local law enforcement, the media, noticed the pattern of disappearances? Was this a larger network, a group pulling strings behind the scenes? As the man turned onto a side street, Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something about the street felt off. The buildings here were older, their windows boarded up, and the street lamps flickered sporadically, casting an unsettling glow on the pavement. There was no one else around. The silence was thick, as if the entire block had been abandoned. Ethan slowed his pace, squinting ahead. The man had entered an alleyway between two dilapidated buildings, disappearing from sight. Ethan hesitated for a moment, a cold sweat beginning to form on his brow. This could be a trap, but he couldn't turn back now. He needed answers. He moved swiftly, entering the alley and pushing forward into the shadows. The dim light from the street lamps barely reached the alley's entrance, and the walls of the buildings towered on either side, closing in on him. It felt as though the alley was closing in, the air growing heavier with each step. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to turn back. He reached for his gun, his fingers tightening around the handle, ready for whatever might be lurking around the next corner. But as he moved deeper into the alley, a strange noise reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic thumping, as if something was pounding against the concrete. Suddenly, the man appeared again, stepping out from the shadows just ahead of him. Ethan froze, his hand still hovering near his holster. The man's back was to him, and he was standing in front of a rusted metal door, his hand raised as if he was about to knock. He didn't seem surprised or alarmed by Ethan's presence. It was almost as though he'd been expecting him. Ethan didn't know what to do. Should he confront the man, or wait for backup? He couldn't afford to make the wrong move, especially if this was part of a larger operation. He needed more information, more context, before he could make his next move. But before he could decide, the man turned around slowly, his cold, emotionless eyes locking onto Ethan's. There was something predatory in that gaze, as if the man was fully aware of Ethan's presence and had been waiting for this confrontation. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even nervous. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You should have stayed inside the diner, Officer Carter." Ethan's stomach dropped at the mention of his name. How did this man know who he was? And how had he known he would follow him? The man took a step closer, his expression unchanging. "You're a nuisance, and I don't think you understand just how deep this goes. You're in over your head." Ethan's grip tightened on his gun. "Who are you? What's going on here? What happened to the boy? What do you want with these kids?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was cold, detached, as though he were savoring the moment. "I think you already know more than you should, but you're just a small piece of the puzzle. This is much bigger than you or me. The children you've seen, the ones you're looking for, they're part of something far more significant." Ethan's mind raced. This was bigger than a kidnapping ring. This was something organized, deliberate, and powerful. But what was the end goal? What was their purpose? "What do you mean? What's the point of all of this?" Ethan's voice was low, but the tremor of urgency was unmistakable. The man's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing. "The point is simple. Control. Power. You wouldn't understand." Before Ethan could respond, the man's eyes flicked to the side. A signal of some kind. Ethan's instincts kicked in, but it was already too late. The sound of footsteps approached from both ends of the alley. Figures emerged from the shadows, dark shapes, their movements quick and coordinated, like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the man stepped back, his voice now laced with an eerie calmness. "You're not the first to chase this trail, officer, and you won't be the last." Without warning, one of the figures lunged at Ethan, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The cold metal of a knife pressed against his throat, sending a jolt of panic through his system. His gun was knocked from his hand, clattering to the ground. "Take him," the man said, his voice cold and disinterested. "He's not a priority. We've got bigger fish to fry." Ethan struggled against the grip of the figure holding him, his mind racing as he tried to assess his options. He had to get out of this. He had to stay alive long enough to figure out what was really happening here. But as they began to pull him toward the door, he realized that this wasn't just some random criminal operation. This was an organized network, and it was far more dangerous than he could have imagined. These people weren't just criminals. They were a shadow organization, pulling strings behind the scenes, orchestrating something that went beyond anything Ethan could understand. And in the center of it all was the boy who had warned him, the boy who knew too much. Ethan's vision blurred as he was shoved through the door into the darkness beyond. The sound of it slamming shut echoed in the alley, and in that instant, he realized with a chilling certainty, the real game had just begun. The unraveling. The door slammed shut behind Ethan with a deafening thud, and for a moment, everything went still. The darkness in the narrow room pressed in on him, and the sound of his heartbeat thudded in his ears. He strained to see, but his eyes hadn't adjusted to the dim light yet. The figures who had captured him were now just shadows in the corners of the room, their presence looming like a cold, suffocating fog. The grip on his arms was firm, unyielding. One of the figures, taller than the others, stepped closer, his breath hot against Ethan's ear. "You've made a mistake, officer. You should have listened to the boy." Ethan struggled, trying to regain some control of the situation, but his body was held in place by two of the figures. He was at their mercy now, and for the first time in a long while, he realized just how fragile this situation was. These people weren't your run-of-the-mill criminals. They were something else entirely. There was an organized, deliberate quality to their actions, a sense of precision and power that unnerved him. The man in the corner, the one who had spoken to him earlier, stepped forward, his cold eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "You really don't get it, do you? The boy's warning was your last chance. Now you're part of something much bigger. You've seen too much. And once you know too much, there's no going back." Ethan's pulse raced as the words sank in. "What are you talking about? What's going on here?" The man smiled, sharp and cruel. It's not about what's going on here, officer. It's about what's going to happen next. The children, the disappearances, the boy you're chasing. It's all part of a plan. A plan that's been years in the making, and you've just become a complication. His heart pounded in his chest, and the truth was starting to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't just a case of missing children. This was a conspiracy. An operation so well coordinated and insidious that it was beyond anything he could have imagined. These people were playing a much larger game, and Ethan had been unwittingly thrown into the center of it. He was just a pawn, a small part of a much grander design. The man took a step back, glancing at the others. Take him to the holding area. Let's see if he talks. One of the figures nodded and roughly shoved Ethan forward, toward the back of the room. As he stumbled, his mind raced. He couldn't let them take him any further. He had to find a way out, find a way to warn Daniels, to expose whatever was happening here. But his arms were pinned, and his body was fatigued from the struggle. The figure who had grabbed him earlier spoke again, his voice cold and clinical. You're a cop, right? You should understand the importance of keeping quiet. People like you, you're expendable. We're beyond the law now. You're not in charge here anymore. Ethan's throat tightened, but he managed to force out a response. You're making a mistake. This isn't just about you. You have no idea what you're really involved in. You think you're in control. You're wrong. The figure sneered, tightening his grip. You think you're the hero, don't you? All the cops think they're the hero, but you're just another cog in the machine. And right now, the machine doesn't need you. The words stung, but they didn't break Ethan. The rage simmering inside him was beginning to fuel his resolve. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to be silenced. The boy had given him the warning. The pieces were falling into place, and no matter how dangerous these people were, Ethan wasn't going to back down. As they dragged him down the narrow hallway, the walls lined with peeling paint and exposed pipes, his mind worked quickly. He had to get out of here. He had to warn Daniels, gather a team, and blow the lid off this entire operation. But he needed more information. He needed to understand what was really going on, what these people were trying to do. The group pushed through a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway, and Ethan was thrown into a small, cold room. The air inside was thick and musty, the faint smell of chemicals lingering in the air. There were no windows, just a single flickering fluorescent light overhead. It felt like a place meant for keeping people in the dark, both literally and figuratively. One of the figures stepped forward, his hands tightening around a set of handcuffs. Stay put, officer. You'll find out soon enough. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything he could use. There had to be a way out. But as he scanned the walls, he realized that this room wasn't just a holding cell. It was a place for interrogation. The metal chair in the middle of the room, the thick restraints bolted to the floor, told him all he needed to know. These people weren't in the business of just holding people. They were in the business of breaking them. The man who had been leading the group stepped forward again, his expression unreadable. You're smarter than most, officer. I'll give you that. But in the end, it won't matter. You're just another problem to clean up. Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But the reality of his situation was beginning to set in. These people were dangerous. They weren't just after him. They were after something much bigger, and he was standing in their way. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, and a new figure stepped inside. A tall woman, her features sharp and precise, her gaze calculating. She wore a dark suit, her posture rigid as though she was used to commanding respect. Is he ready? She asked, her voice cold and commanding. The man nodded. He's not talking, but we're ready to move forward. The woman stepped closer to Ethan, her eyes scanning him as if he were an experiment rather than a human being. You're a bit more stubborn than I anticipated, officer, but that won't matter. You'll talk. Everyone does eventually. Ethan met her gaze, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "You're wrong. I'm not going to talk. And whatever you're trying to do, I'll stop it." She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a thin, amused smile. "You really think you're the one who's going to stop us? You're out of your league. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ethan clenched his fists, every fiber of his being screaming at him to fight back. He wasn't going to let these people destroy everything. Destroy the children. Destroy whatever it was they were trying to control. He wasn't going to let it happen. But as the woman stepped closer, he realized something more chilling. It wasn't just the children they were after. It was control. They were manipulating the system, the law, even people like him, for a much larger, more sinister purpose. And now that he was involved, there was no going back. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. He wasn't just fighting for the children. He was fighting for his own life. The woman raised a hand, and the man stepped back, allowing her to approach. "You're going to help us, officer, whether you want to or not." But as she spoke, Ethan's mind was already working, already plotting his escape. He had no choice now. He had to survive. And in order to do that, he had to outsmart them. With every ounce of strength left in him, he prepared for the fight ahead. The real battle was just beginning. And Ethan Carter wasn't about to lose. The last move. Ethan's heart was still racing as he sat in the cold metal chair, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The room had grown even darker, the flickering fluorescent light casting eerie shadows on the walls, making the figures around him look almost inhuman. The woman in the dark suit, who had entered just moments ago, was now standing in front of him, her cold gaze assessing him like a predator sizing up its prey. Her smile remained, but it wasn't warm. It was calculating, predatory. "You're stronger than most. I'll give you that. But there's always a breaking point, Officer Carter. Everyone has one." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he forced himself to remain calm, despite the bone-chilling fear that threatened to rise within him. He had no intention of letting them see him break, no matter how much they tried to pressure him. These people wanted him to talk, wanted to know what he had discovered, but he wasn't going to make it easy for them. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the truth, for the children, for everything that had brought him to this point. The woman took a slow step toward him, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're some kind of hero, some lone wolf out to save the day. But you're not. You're just a small part of the equation, officer. You're insignificant, a mere speed bump in our way." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to help you. Whatever you're planning, I won't be a part of it." The woman smirked, as if she had been expecting that response. "Of course not. But you'll talk eventually. They all do. The more you resist, the more you'll break. Everyone does." Ethan stayed silent, his mind racing. He was out of options, at least in the physical sense. His hands were tied, and his body was exhausted. But his mind was still his. And as long as he had that, he wasn't finished yet. The woman took another step closer, her face mere inches from his. "You think you're special, but you're not. You're just one more obstacle to eliminate. And when we're done with you, no one will even remember you existed." Her words were sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. But Ethan's resolve didn't waver. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of them. He had been in worse situations before, and he had survived. He just needed to outlast them. As the woman turned away, signaling to the other figures in the room, Ethan's mind snapped into action. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The more time passed, the more likely it was that they would succeed in whatever plan they had set in motion. He had to make his move now. He remembered the boy who had warned him. What had he said? 2 words, whispered in fear, yet they had been enough to send Officer Carter into a state of panic. What had the boy known? What was it about those 2 words that had triggered such an urgent response from the officers back at the diner? Ethan couldn't forget the look in the boy's eyes. It wasn't just fear, It was something deeper, something that spoke of knowledge. The boy knew something about the people behind this operation, and Ethan was certain it had something to do with the larger conspiracy. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up, and the woman had returned, flanked by two more figures. They were holding a set of tools, each one more menacing than the last. Ethan knew exactly what they were planning. "You're not going to leave this room until you talk, officer," she said, her voice dripping with cold certainty. "We'll break you, one way or another." Ethan's mind raced, but his resolve remained unbroken. He wouldn't let them win. There had to be a way out, a way to turn the tables. His eyes flicked around the room, searching for anything he could use, any advantage he could gain. The walls were bare, save for a few old pipes running along the ceiling. The only light came from the flickering bulb above, casting weak shadows around the space. His heart hammered in his chest as he considered the situation. But in that moment, something clicked. He wasn't trapped. Not yet. The woman stepped closer, as if she could sense his resolve. She reached out, lifting a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "This will make things easier for both of us, officer. A little something to loosen your tongue." Her voice was silky, smooth, yet there was an undeniable edge to it. She knew she had him cornered. And in that moment, Ethan felt the crushing weight of helplessness. But then, just as the woman was about to approach him with the syringe, the door to the room suddenly slammed open, and a burst of light flooded the space. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But the sound of boots hitting the concrete floor was unmistakable. "Let him go," a voice barked, commanding, authoritative. It was Daniel's. Ethan felt a surge of relief flood through him, but it was quickly tempered with disbelief. How had Daniels found him? Had he somehow followed the trail? Was it the boy's warning that had led him here? Without waiting for an answer, Daniel stormed into the room, flanked by several officers, all of them armed and ready. They didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, efficiently, taking down the figures who had been holding Ethan captive, restraining them with ease. The woman in the dark suit backed away, her eyes wide with sudden panic. You shouldn't have come here," she hissed. "Shut up," Daniels barked, his voice laced with fury. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder. It's over." The woman narrowed her eyes, her lip curling into a sneer. "You have no idea what you've just walked into, Daniels. You don't understand who you're up against." "I don't care who you are," Daniels growled, advancing on her. "You're done." As the officers moved to restrain the remaining figures in the room, the woman's gaze flicked to Ethan. Her expression changed from cold defiance to something darker, something more dangerous. "This isn't over, Officer Carter," she spat. "You've just opened the door to a nightmare you can't close, and now you'll never escape it." But Ethan wasn't listening. His heart was still pounding, but he couldn't let himself get distracted. He had a million questions swirling in his mind, and he wasn't about to let this woman walk away without answering them. He glanced at Daniels, who had noticed his gaze. "Are you okay?" Daniels asked, his voice softer now. Ethan nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Yeah, I think so." Daniels turned to the woman, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to tell us everything. Everything about the missing children. Everything about this operation." The woman smirked. "You think you can just waltz in here and make us talk? You'll never stop what's coming. It's too late." But Ethan wasn't backing down. Not now, not after everything he had been through. He had come too far. The truth was within his grasp, and nothing was going to stop him from uncovering it. As the officers restrained the remaining figures and the woman was cuffed, Ethan knew that the answers he had been seeking were finally within reach. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Whoever was behind this operation wasn't going to stop just because a few agents were arrested. They would come after him. And they would come after Daniels too. But Ethan was ready. He wasn't alone anymore. and he wasn't going to let them win. The game had changed, and now they were going to play by his rules.